I guess we'll start out. My name's Kevin Carter. I'm the web guy for Casey Stengel chapter. We'd like to welcome Mark Armour and Dan Levitt, and they're going to talk about their book, Intentional Balk, and we'll hand the ball off to them.
Well, thank you. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is what it looks like. It's pretty attractive, I think, book. And I guess I'll get started, and then I'll pass over to Dan. We're just going to be pretty informal here, but so we began working on this book 3 years ago or so, and with the thought that there'd been an awful lot of cheating that has gone on in baseball in the last handful of years. It seemed like there was always something going on. It was certainly steroids dominated the baseball off the field news for a decade or so, and then of course the thing that was the big scandal at the time we started working on this was the sign stealing, which really was announced that the Astros sign stealing, which took place mainly in 2017, and it was the story broke at the end of 2019, a couple years later, and that was a big thing. And while we were working on the book, we made quite a bit of progress. In fact, the whole spider tack controversy happened, largely based in 2021 in terms of when it really broke and became a big story where they were checking gloves and whatnot. So we decided a few things. One, that we believed as historians that cheating had been going on in baseball for a long time, over 100 years, probably since the very beginning of the sport. And also that it had never really been told, the story had never really been told as one story. There'd certainly been people that had written about the spitball, and people have certainly written books about sign stealing or articles about sign stealing. There's been a lot of good books about performance enhancing drugs, but there's never really been a good attempt to sort of step back and talk about the culture of cheating within the game of baseball, how it came to be, whether it's come and gone, whether it's worse today than it used to be, and so that's what we decided to do, and that is largely what this book is. We do divide it up into different. We do talk about these things sort of individually. We have a chapter on the pitcher, a chapter on the bat, a chapter on front office cheating with setting up your roster. We have a couple of chapters on PEDs, one largely on amphetamines and one on steroids. So we sort of talk about them separately, but there are themes that kind of run through the book. One of which is that baseball people have been cheating since the very beginning. Most of this sign stealing began in the 19th century, certainly. Performance enhancing drugs, there was at least some stories in the 19th century, and certainly by the 1950s there were stories about it. People have been using doctoring the pitches back 120 years. It became illegal in 1920, but it never really stopped. People have been doctoring the bat forever, etc. So we talk through all these stories. Some of them are familiar, some of them maybe not, some of them are funny, some of them are maybe serious, or not maybe serious, definitely serious. So that was like the story of the book. And the other theme that kind of runs through the book is our belief, which we talk about in the book, that a lot of it arises from innovation, that many of the more smartest, most probably, people that are sort of on the cutting edge of learning how to play the game as optimally as possible, are the people that have often crossed over the line. We talked about before this. I started talking about the book, that we were talking about the Dodgers, and of course, Branch Rickey is probably the most famous executive in baseball history, and probably the best. Well, he also has a cheating story. A lot of that took place when he was with the Cardinals, but he, as the general manager and president of the Cardinals, illegally did many illegal things with his farm system, in having agreements with teams that he wasn't allowed to have, with players he wasn't allowed to have. And this went on for a while, and he was punished for it. This is not a borderline situation. He very clearly knew what the rules were. He clearly broke the rules. He himself wasn't really punished, but the Cardinals were punished. They lost a lot of these players. So, and then of course the Astros themselves were talked about very often before this sign stealing thing broke as being the most cutting edge, smartest, most innovative major league front office. And I think that those two facts, which is one being that they were smart and innovative and cutting edge, and two, that they orchestrated likely the largest sign stealing operation in baseball history, that those two things are not opposing thoughts. If they actually, that there may be some overlap in what would cause you to be one and what would cause you to be the other. And we talk about that throughout the book as well. So again, it's largely a story of all the ways that one can cheat. And we think a lot of the stories are just very interesting, and many of them are very funny as well. So I didn't actually tell Dan what I was going to talk about, so I'm kind of like leaving him to like talk now, just because he and I wrote the book together, so he deserves to talk about it too. But hopefully I left you some good stuff there, Dan.
I might feel like Mickey Mantle after Casey Stengel at the
Yes, that's a good point.
No. Mark covered it really well. I would just sort of, add a couple of nuanced points. Our previous books have all been on, Mark and I have done 2 previous books on team building. And in many ways, and we looked at why some teams succeed, why some teams don't, what are sort of the teams that are winning, what are they doing? And in many ways, this is a continuation of that theme, in the senses, as he mentioned, we In Pursuit of Pennants, the paperback version with a new epilogue came out in the spring of 2018. And we talked about how the Astros were at the cutting edge of innovation and what they'd been doing. And obviously, as he mentioned, they were also the cutting edge of cheating. And so in many ways, this book was a continuation of the way that, we had sort of looked at what makes teams win and what are teams doing and what's sort of the cutting edge, and not just teams, but obviously players as well. Spider Tack, one of the interesting things about that, for example, is it was introduced in about 2010, 2011 by a couple of fellows who were, they were World's Strongest Man competition. So they were learning. One of the events in the World's Strongest Man competition was carrying these big Atlas stones, these giant rocks. And Spider Tack, two fellows who were doing this, invented it so they could grip the rocks better. And they mentioned that at about 2016, 2017, they started getting orders for this stuff coming from major league clubhouses. And they had no idea, like, why would we be getting orders for this stuff from major league clubhouses? Well, they quickly figured out, and it was some of the pitchers who were at the cutting edge of trying to figure out how to design pitches that were doing this. And the theme around innovation is that it wasn't just the Spider Tack, but that it was the introduction of high-speed video that so you could not only grip the ball better, but you could see what it was doing when you threw it. You could measure, you could see on your hand, if you exactly where you were putting your fingers and exactly how you moved your hand and what they did to the ball. And then the third thing, of course, is this whole idea that you could actually see how much the ball broke with, Edgertronic or Rapsodo, these other new machines that would allow you to see this. So there was this coming together of a number of innovations that allowed, people at the forefront that were willing to cheat to take cheating to a next level. And I would, we have a number of themes to run through it, and Mark covered them. One other I would emphasize is that, many within baseball don't really look at cheating as a moral issue. They look really at a sort of a cost benefit analysis. George Bamberger, the Mets and more famously the Brewers coach, manager, talked about this, and how players and others within the game, they don't look at cheating as whether it's right or wrong, but they look at it as, what's the benefit of this and what's the penalty if I get caught? And once you realize that in many ways is looking at it, it's okay, it's not wrong to do this. It's what's the penalty if I get caught? And, we make the analogy to speeding where, when everybody's going 65 in a 60-mile-an-hour zone, it kind of works. But when you have someone that starts going 85, all of a sudden it doesn't. So when people are going 65, again, maybe it's not a moral issue if you're breaking the law, but at some point, it whether it's a moral issue or not, and it obviously is in many ways, but it also starts to disrupt the game. And so we talk about, sort of, some of the motivations behind cheating and just sort of how it's viewed. One of the things that Mark came up with, a term that we use in the book, and I really like, is consensual ethic. And it's sort of like, the unwritten rules, but without all the connotation of unwritten rules. And that, in many ways, the players define, and the managers and the umpires and the owners to a certain degree define what's okay. Coaches always standing out of the batter box. Well, it's just too much of a pain to enforce something like that. And so in many ways, we talk about sort of this, when people sort of look at cheating or players look at cheating, what is the consensual ethic as well as what's actually written in the rule book? And we talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, we use players or people within baseball a lot of times to help us figure out what cheating is bad and what cheating is not bad. We kind of started with the idea that, okay, first of all, we define cheating at the start of the book as people that break the rules, and the rules are the Major League Rule Book and then various other manuals that teams use that tell them how they're allowed to make trades and sign contracts and whatnot, as well as the joint drug agreement. That's sort of a rule book. So teams or people within the game that break those rules, and they do so in order to help themselves or their team. So we don't count throwing the World Series as cheating. That's a different problem. You're cheating to lose in that case. So we're talking about really people that are attempting to break rules to win, or to play better. And what we found is a lot of people that actually talk about this pretty openly. Like, for example, Tony Gwynn during the PED scandal, like about 20 years ago, he was able to sort of, he answered the question about amphetamines and said, well, as far as players are concerned, as far as the people, in the locker rooms and in the clubhouses, what players believe is that amphetamines are just restorative drugs. They're there to, get you through the game. They're there to get you recovered from a hangover or any other kind of short-term ailment, and everybody thinks they're okay. Whereas human growth hormone and other anabolics are not. They're considered cheating. So as fans, many people look at that and say, well, I don't see what the difference is. Well, we just mentioned this is what the players believe. The players like Keith Hernandez in one of his books, I think it was called If at First, he talks about what he believes is the player's view about doctoring pitches. And he said, well, as far as I'm concerned, and he seemed to believe that he was not unusual in this regard, anything you do on the field in front of 50,000 people, in front of 4 umpires, that is you trying to get away with stuff, and that's okay. Whereas when you cork a bat, you're doing that at home. It's a very secretive thing, and frankly, the only way anyone's ever been caught corking a bat is when it breaks. If it doesn't break, you get away with it forever. And he believes that that's a different kind of thing. We also talk about players that feel differently about that, and some of these things even evolve. We found a story written in the early 1960s that talked about a lot of the deceptive things that you can do on a baseball field, which players talked about openly as things that they believed might be cheating, but they were okay with it. And one of them was very famous for many, many years, certainly when I was a kid, came to be known as the neighborhood play, which is that the shortstop or second baseman, when they turn a double play in middle infield, it became habitual that the player would not touch the base. There was a time in the 1950s where that was considered, well, maybe something that we should try and stop. Bill Mazeroski did it, was supposedly really good at it. Bobby Richardson, all the good second basemen, they were so quick with their feet that they wouldn't actually touch the base, and that was an advantage, etc. And then at some point, by the time I came along and I was playing baseball in the 70s, no one touched the base. It was just become like this skill that everybody learned how to do. That is gone now because of instant replay. You have to if you don't touch the base, you're not going to get the call. But there were also apparently there was a pretty common thing that also happened into the 60s and 70s, where first basemen who made a habit of fielding the throw from the infielder and pulling their foot off the base on purpose in order to get a little bit longer of a stretch and get the ball a little bit quicker. And there were some people like Ed Kranepool talked about how he learned this from Gil Hodges when Gil Hodges was on the Mets as a player in the early 60s, and Kranepool was a kid and he learned it from Hodges, and Hodges was considered to be particularly adept at this. Again, that's the kind of thing that's kind of gone from the game as well. But I think that we do spend a lot of time in the book talking about players and people within the game that have discussed the idea of fooling the umpire as something that is okay, that's kind of what you're supposed to do. And even Nestor Shylock we quote him as saying that, yeah, that's my job is to try and catch them, and their job is to do whatever they can. So I guess you could say that baseball has a very elastic sense of sort of what's right and wrong. And I think it's easy for us on occasion to sort of raise our hand and say that this is evil or this is unethical, and how can we raise our kids in this kind of environment. But I will say that it's a very squishy notion of what's okay. And the umpires and the players kind of have an understanding of what's right and wrong. And then occasionally the commissioner or the league presidents would come along and say, okay, umpires, we need this to be called, like the balk. We need to call the balk now because the balk's getting out of hand. But tough job.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I just piggybacking on Mark. I mean, all of us who have played baseball or softball as kids, I mean, you learn that if you trap a ball in the outfield, by the time you're in about 5th grade, you hold it up as if you caught it. I mean, that's just sort of the way we learn to play. And obviously today, that with the instant replay, that's gone. But I guess the deception of the umpire is pretty much, I mean, there's very few people who would say that deceiving the umpire is there should be a punishment for that. And that's too bad in many ways. But I mean, I don't know that anybody would want to punish them. There's the famous Todd Frazier, and some of you might remember that play. It's a fun play from YouTube. In about 2018, he was going over to catch a foul ball. He was playing third base. He reached into the stands, and he came up holding a ball, and the umpire called the batter out. I don't remember who the batter was, but I mean, when you looked at it in replay, he didn't catch it. He ended up picking up a ball that wasn't even the actual baseball. It was not a real baseball that he held up, and then he threw it back to the kid who was sitting there after the play. And afterwards, I mean, he was not embarrassed about it. He was joking about it, and most people were laughing about it with him. And people laugh about it on the YouTube. So I mean, there's one of our themes we talk about is why is some types of cheating treated differently than others, and that's the deception of the umpire is one of the sort of the lines that we draw where people look at one type of cheating different than another type of cheating. And there's all kinds of other things we look at, and Mark can jump into some of these. One that I talk about is the complexity of the cheating. With sign stealing, for example, when it was somebody out in left field with binoculars waving a towel to the batter that could have been seen, and maybe people could check up on it. That's very different than the idea of having a bunch of interns engaged in it and you have this video right by the dugout that isn't really visible from anywhere else in the ballpark. And you have this elaborate sort of electronic, then you have the spreadsheet, which by itself isn't illegal, that can help you decipher the signals even quicker. And then you're transmitting them electronically to the dugout. So I mean, if there's the mastermind effect makes this view, I think, has us view cheating differently than others. And I talked at the SABR convention about sign stealing during the 20th century and how there was actually no rule against it, relative to any of it, but particularly, notable is the 51 Giants. And I think part of the reason they're viewed the way they are now, people sort of wondering whether they cheated or not. I mean, even though, again, it was not technically against the rules, though it was against this consensual ethic that we talked to it, but because it was so elaborate, it had this buzzer system and wires running. And I think there's a sense that is a different sort of mastermind to cheating than just one person waving a towel. Again, I think maybe a little of that goes to PEDs where, if it's, somebody sticking themselves with a needle, that may be viewed a little bit differently, at least it seemed to be early on, as opposed to these very extensive regimens that came later where there were multiple drugs that were administered, on a very defined calendar basis, very defined schedule as to what you took when, so that you could evade the testing. I think once you were trying to evade testing, I think that was viewed a little bit differently than not. Although, again, I think with steroids, I think there's a general sense that that was cheating. But again, I think that with the evasion of testing on a complex systematic plan, I think had a different connotation than just sort of the stuff that came before.
So I think at this point we can probably just take questions. I actually have I wanted to mention that my friend and umpire Perry Barber, I notice here, I always wince when I talk about umpires in front of Perry, because I feel like she might have a different view. That I don't want to speak for umpires. I have talked to some umpires about some of this stuff recently, although and I even talked to Perry about this many months ago. I don't know if she remembers this in the early stages of this, because I was trying to track down some things, but probably the most recent thing that is, you can find occasionally some people on the internet or on Twitter or something that consider pitch framing to be cheating, right? Because that is essentially, you're attempting to fool the umpire. You're attempting to get the umpire to make a call, and despite what they say, you're trying to get them to make a call that isn't actually the right call, right? You're trying to turn a ball into a strike, and that is in the same, I think, in the same neighborhood as the neighborhood play, or chopping a ball in the outfield, and holding up the glove. I mean, it's the same thing where you know one thing and you're hoping you can get the umpire to call something else. So what do you think about pitch framing, Perry?
Yes, a good point. Hi, Mark, and
Hi.
hi, Dan.
Very.
I love these discussions because they start a conversation, and a lot of the time it's internal conversation about ethics and morality and what is wrong and what is right and what fits within my particular framework of ethical conduct. And your take on the word cheating, I loved it when you said it has a very elastic definition, because that's so true. And I mean, it's a very existential question. You know, what is cheating to one person is just working within the framework of the existing rules to take advantage of them, which is basically what pitch framing is. But some regard that as cheating. It's not complying with the letter of the law, or it's trying to go around it or evade it or somehow undermine the rules or the laws. And a lot of the time, those smaller infractions, like first baseman, like Hernandez used to put one of his feet outside of the foul line, which when the ball is put in play is illegal. All players have to be in fair territory, but he would do it, or runners would do it sometimes to get a running start on a fly when they tagged out. But umpires don't generally enforce those rules unless somebody complains about them, unless somebody says, hey, look, that coach is so far out of the box and he's distracting me. The batter can't see all the way down the line, something like that. Then an umpire will say, okay, yeah, I'll take care of it. But most of the time, you know, like when John McGraw used to grab runners' belts when they were running around third base when he was coaching to keep them from, you know, scoring. There wasn't a rule against it, I don't think. There's a rule against interfering with a runner, definitely, but back then when there was only one umpire, it was very hard to be policed, so he got away with it a lot, I think. But yeah, pitch framing to me is kind of a bogus art anyway. It always has, because frankly, umpires can't be fooled. I mean, you know, we're perfect out there. We can see everything. We know everything. But yeah, I think that cheating is whatever anybody defines it as, and I can't make any moral judgments. I mean, unless it involves murder or, you know, real harm to somebody. But I just love it that you have written a book about it, and such a really interesting, clever one, and that you start these conversations about it, because people, you know, we want to know how to do the right thing, I think, most of the time, for ways to do the wrong thing. So this helps. I mean, it's helped me. So thank you.
Well, one of the things we talk about a little bit.
Please come out anything that you want, but you cannot tell Conrad. If you go to rehab, I won't tell you.
Brad, there you go.
Okay. One of the things we talk about a little bit is that baseball, and I don't know if this is unique. I assume it isn't, but it's the only sport I can think of where there are rules that everyone knows about that you have to appeal to the umpire to get them to make the call, right? The notion of somebody misses the base and the umpire sees that they missed the base and they just zip their lip. It's the other team's job to ask you to make that call, and the same thing with you know, leaving the base too soon on a fly ball, and even something as silly as batting out of order. I always joke, like, if you want Aaron Judge to break the record, just let him bat every time. right? And as long as the other team doesn't complain,
Right.
you can do that. Well, anyway, I just think it's funny that there are these appeal plays, and I spoke to Dale Scott, who some of you may know. He has a book out as well this year. He's a retired major league umpire, 30-year umpire, and I met him this summer, and I asked him about some of this stuff as well. And I asked him about, for example, the rule that is, I think, is the least enforced rule in the rule book. There's probably another one, which is, the coaches have to stand in the coach's box. And I just sort of asked him about that. I don't really care myself if they call that. I just think it's funny that they have a rule. And he said, well, we treat that as an appeal play. That basically if the manager comes to me and says, hey, that team is standing outside the coach's boxes, then I will say, okay, from now on, both teams have to stand in the coach's boxes the rest of the game. And I said, well, has anybody ever done that? And he goes, yeah. He goes, I think Earl Weaver did it a couple times, but usually they're mad at us for something else that happened. Like they're mad about they're mad about a previous call. They're pissed at the other team about something, and they decide that this is how they're going to do it. So I just think that it is maybe not coincidental that baseball has this notion of the umpire being a little bit of a give and take. Like you're basically asking the umpire to make calls, at least in a few cases. And I think that lends itself to the idea that maybe you should deceive umpires in other ways. If you can deceive them about,
go for it.
Go for
have
it.
a
Right.
larger tolerance, greater tolerance than others, and go for it. If you can get away with it and the umpire doesn't say anything or nobody complains so that the umpire doesn't do anything about it, like I said, go for it.
Well, I appreciate and I don't want to step on Dan here, but I appreciate what Perry said about this being a conversation, because compared to anything else I've ever written or co-written and then had to talk about, this is the one where everyone has an opinion, and your opinion is just as interesting as my opinion, right? This is not this is not something where I wrote a biography of someone and I know more about that person than you, and you're just listening to me tell you all this stuff. This is a case where, how you feel about pitch framing is interesting. I mean, it's part of the conversation, and I think it's a fun thing about this topic. When I was working on this, I talked to my wife a lot about it, because she was a longtime athlete, mostly soccer. She played soccer well into her adult life, and she is also the most honest person I know. And she said, "Oh, I would never cheat." All this, I would give her examples, and she goes, "No, that would never happen. I would never do that." And she also played basketball. And I said, so if you were playing basketball, a pickup basketball game, she played in the city league team. I said, if you were playing and you had the ball and you stepped on the out of bounds line, would you stop play and hand the ball to the referee and say, I stepped on the line? And she goes, well, no, I wouldn't do that. I said, you're a cheater. That's the thing. And it's like a slippery slope, right? If there's an official, then I think that most people believe that it's now the official's job to make these calls. It is not my job. So anyhow, I'm hoping other people have other things they want to say.
If you don't mind, quickly, could you basically explain the difference between gamesmanship and cheating? Greg Maddux had a habit. If you gave him the outside corner, he just put the ball a little bit further on the outside corner. He'd keep going until you finally called it a ball. And when Reggie Jackson threw out his hip in the 1978 World Series, brilliant gamesmanship. I mean, I hated that play when I saw it in slow motion, but I never liked him as a home run hitter, but he was a smart guy. That was a really brilliant move. And one other thing, when you talk about the 51 series, you brought it up. Chuck Dressen tried to bring binoculars into the dugout to find out who was stealing the signs. He didn't know it was coming from the clubhouse. The umpire came over and told him you can't have binoculars in the clubhouse. So basically, you shouldn't have had binoculars in the scoreboard either. But no one knew about it, so we got away with it. That's just in response to Dan Levitt's comment. But the question
you wanted to have
just regarding the last comment, I would just say that there was actually no rule against binoculars, but that if it was sort of like the appeal play, if you complained to the umpire, I think Steve O'Neill in 1950 was the first person who actually got an umpire to do anything. They'd go out and make put the binoculars away. Whitey Herzog accused Raleigh Finger when Whitey was managing the Royals. He accused Raleigh Fingers of the A's of having binoculars out in the bullpen, and he got the umpire to go out and make them put the binoculars away. So you're right. I mean, it absolutely, it's sort of interesting. There was no actual rule against these binoculars. Paul Richards in 1956 complained about the White Sox stealing signs when he was managing the Orioles, and he complained to Will Harridge. And I talked about this at the SABR convention for any of you folks who were there. I mean, Harridge gave the most incredibly feckless answer, which was something like, we can't, it's not illegal. There's no rule against it. And even if there was, I don't know how we would police it. This is referring to binoculars in the outfield. So it's interesting. Yeah, if the umpires on occasion would do something, and probably you're right. If they were in the dugout, that's a good point, that they would do something about it. And if you could figure out how to get them to go to the outfield and see if they could find them out there, they do that too. But sometimes they would, and sometimes they wouldn't.
Thank you. And the gamesmanship and cheating.
Yeah, I think the umpires also were, and this is true of the spitball, like in the 1960s. The umpires had no interest in policing a rule if the league wasn't going to back them, right? So, what's the point of going out and doing something to Eli Perry if the commissioner or the league president is just going to say, you know what, it's okay, just and that's essentially what happened. I mean, it's kind of this whole thing is a partnership between these various parts of the game, and I think that we end up with the game that everyone wants us to have, and occasionally something happens like what happened with Spider Tap a couple of years ago, where the commissioner ruled that it had gone too far and he wanted the umpires to check the gloves and the hands and everything. It didn't mean that this was a new problem. It meant that, well, first of all, that was the year, if you remember, there were like 7 no-hitters in the first 2 months. And I think it was they thought like, okay, things have gone a little too far now. Let's start checking these guys' hands. And then of course, things, at least temporarily, until they figured something else out, things changed.
But
We
could you
didn't
address
really
the
define gamesmanship versus cheating in the book sort of directly. My take would be, and Mark may have his own, is that I would view gamesmanship as umpire deception without sort of outside substances. So I would not putting spider tack on the ball in that, but I would put all of the stuff that we were talking about, the neighborhood play, pulling your foot off first base too quickly, holding up the fake ball, pitch framing. If you're pitching, pitchers oftentimes, particularly when before the 4 umpires, they'd have their foot maybe 6 inches in front of the rubber, and sometimes they still do that. There's still complaints about pitchers putting their foot in front of the rubber to get an extra shorten the pitching distance. So to me, all of the umpire deception stuff is what I would consider gamesmanship. Thank you.
And it is, I agree with what Dan said. And I think the players get very angry about it in the moment, and then time goes by, and then oftentimes they realize, like, what would I have done in that situation? A good example is the one that Joe mentioned earlier about Reggie Jackson. Now that play, Tommy Lasorda was angry about that play until the day he died. I mean, if you brought that up to Lasorda, even in the 2015, he would walk away from the reporter. He was so angry at what Jackson did, which if you guys don't remember, you can see it on YouTube. He basically put his hip into a a throw that was it was a throw. I think it was a double play they were
Double
trying to
play, yes.
turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Davey Lopes, I think, was throwing the ball to Steve Garvey, and Jackson had already been forced out, so he was out, and he'd only gotten like 5 steps from first to second, and he just stuck his hip out and deflected the ball out of play. And I think it's almost undoubtedly the Yankees wouldn't have won that game without that play. They scored 2 more runs that inning, and they won in extra innings. So it's hard to imagine how they could have won without it. And afterwards, Roger Angel wrote about this quite a bit. He was at the game, and he went into the Dodger locker room. He talked to Garvey about it, and Garvey was sort of the way Garvey is. I mean, he was kind of a politician. He was kind of angry, and he said, "Well, I got to admit, most people would do that." But then they also asked Garvey whether he would do it, and he said, "No, I wouldn't have done it," which I don't know if that's true or not. And then another example of that's sort of in this category, I think, happened to Derek Jeter near the end of his career when he faked getting hit by a pitch.
Right.
It was a game against Tampa Bay, and Joe Madden was the umpire. I mean, the manager of Tampa Bay, and he came out and he just went ballistic. It was a very clear that what he was doing. I mean, Jeter, to his credit, it was a ball that was in on his hands and it hit the bat, and Jeter said it hit his hand. And not only that, but he actually got the trainer to come out. The trainer sprayed some stuff on his hand. He did the whole 9 yards, and he got first base. And Madden came out. He got thrown out of the game, and he went ballistic. The catcher went ballistic, and then afterwards, Madden was in. He asked him about it. So Madden had now cooled down. The game was over, and he just said, "Well, if it was one of my guys, I would have cheered him." So that's sort of gamesmanship in a nutshell. Like, no one likes it when it happens against their team, and I think that a lot of people, I remember people saying that Jeter was just like a steroid user and whatnot. But if you're a Yankee fan, then Jeter's a hero. So this is the nature of sports.
Thank you.
I noticed in the chat that this is actually great. There's one comment from Charlie that said it would be less entertaining if there wasn't attempts to cheat, and then a comment from Alec that says cheating is beyond the bounds of behavior the athletes and fans reasonably expect. I'm not criticizing either of them. I think that's actually one of the fun things about this topic, is that there isn't an answer, at least an answer that we felt comfortable making. I think when we started, I'll speak for myself. When I started, I had this sort of grandiose idea that, like, oh yeah, we can have, like, at the end, we can just like rank the top 10 cheaters of all time, or actually weigh in on all of these things. And then as we went along, the topic is sort of humbling after a while, because you realize, like, I'm actually not comfortable being like the ethical police on this. So
I'll just going to I think Richard Frank's question on cheating by umpires. I think the only stuff that we've ever come across is in the 19th century, where there were some bribes of umpires. One of the funnier stories which we have in the book is the Tigers were accusing the umpire of doing bad things against them and making the wrong call, and the umpire said, "Well, they're just mad at me because I refused to take a bribe from them." And Deacon White, the Hall of Fame third baseman, said, "We know there was no bribe offered because he didn't accept it." So it's the 19th century was sort of a different world for baseball. But actual cheating in the Tim Donaghy of the NBA kind of thing, I don't think there's been any of that.
So there's a question in the chat about corked bats. We do talk about cork bats. We don't. I don't know if we talk about every incident of corking a bat, but we certainly talk about Greg Nettles and Albert Bell and Sammy Sosa. Those are some of the more famous ones. And we also talk about been some studies that have been done by Alan Nathan and others about whether corking a bat actually helps. There's a lot of skepticism about this, whether it's just a placebo effect to have this because what you really want from a bat is you want to swing the bat as hard as you can, and you want the bat to be as heavy as it can be, with your ability to swing the bat not hampered. So every modification you make to that equation is, taking less mass out of the bat hurts the bat in one way and helps it in another way, which is, you can swing it faster. And there's been just so that that your taxpayer or other donations to colleges are put to good use. This has been studied at universities for years. And most of the conclusion seems to be that it has little or to no effect. But the most famous bat corking incidents tend to be pretty funny. Like the stories of how they're caught are kind of funny. Certainly the Nettles story is pretty funny. The Sosa story is funny. I mean, they all have some. I think it was Sosa that said it was no, it was Nettles actually that said it was some fan in Chicago that gave him the bat. And so he was blaming somebody for giving him some bat. And Sosa said his bat was just for batting practice and he made a mistake using the wrong bat. So it's an interesting story.
I'll take the next question, which from Mark regarding off-field offenses, such as the Braves sign stealing scandal or scouting director for the Cardinals, Chris Correa, getting banned for life. I think it's fascinating, the difference, because Chris Correa, who hacked the St. Louis Cardinals scouting director, who hacked into the Astros database, he ended up getting, the feds prosecuted him, the FBI testified against him and got the evidence, and he was sentenced to 46 months in jail, and then put on the permanently banned list, which, I think which at that point probably didn't matter too much given he was in jail. And then the GM of the Braves, who illegally was funneling money to players, international signing players, so that he could sign them, was also put on the permanently ineligible list, the Pete Rose, Joe Jackson list. And what I find interesting, that baseball came down on these people. I mean, they were punished very severely by baseball. Both teams got fairly severe penalties. The Cardinals lost their top 2 draft picks, plus were fined. On the Braves, there was about 15 players. I think 13 players were made free agents that they had signed. So the penalties were fairly severe, and yet, the outrage from the fans was a lot less than it is on Spider Tag. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's sort of fascinating how this stuff is viewed differently, and I just think that stuff that's on the field or that people can relate to, sort of that's directly on the field, I think people feel differently about as fans, which I think that's I don't have an opinion on it one way or the other, how to view it, but I think it's fascinating, and we talk about it because that dichotomy to me is very interesting. How, again, you're going to get banned from baseball for life, and yet, when people talk about cheating, nobody was talking about the Braves when they won the World Series. Now, again, the players that they had signed had probably all been released as free agents, but we don't know whether everybody that they signed illegally was made a free agent or not. Were there other players that were never sort of uncovered in the investigation? I mean, I think signing 16, 17, young international players illegally probably has a bigger effect than sign stealing. I don't know, maybe not, but it was clearly there was never the same backlash that the Astros got. So again, just more of an observation relative to how we view the world as fans.
Yeah, and it was interesting, of course, because the Braves and the Astros played each other in that World Series, and the Astros were getting booed. And I would always take delight in pointing out, it was the Braves that actually got the hammer dropped on them for a scandal, which I think you could, again, I'm not an ethics police, but I think you could certainly make a case that disrupting the lives of teenagers in the Dominican Republic is actually a worse crime. Within baseball circles, and they were punished worse. I mean, Lunau got a 1-year suspension, and Capabella got a lifetime ban. But again, I think that the sign stealing sort of seems worse because it's it's on the field. It's something that we see.
Mark, you ought to take Gaylord Perry since you're his bio guy.
Yeah, Gaylord is. Yeah, I mean, completely unrelated to this. I've sort of been a Gaylord Perry fan from childhood. I think, and the one thing I will say about Perry is Perry was a tremendous pitcher. I mean, he didn't, and there were umpires at the time who we quote in our book that to talk about that this guy was a masterful pitcher, and he threw a lot of great pitches that were legal. And there was a lot of debate even amongst umpires about how often he actually threw a spitball, but that it was in the repertoire, and that was 99% of the battle was having that be an option that people were worried about. Not that he did not throw a spitball. I'm not saying that at all. He did. I'm just saying that he threw a lot of stuff, and that was part of his genius. Interesting thing about the spitball is, they're basically, I'll try to make this quick. There are essentially 3 things you can do to a baseball, broadly speaking. You can put lubrication on it to make it spin less, which is the point of the spitball. I mean, a well-thrown spitball sort of works like a knuckleball. The job is to get it to come out of your hand like a watermelon seed that you're pushing out of your fingers. And the idea is to reduce the spin on the ball and get to drop. You can put sticky stuff on the ball, which has the exact opposite goal, because in that case you're trying to get more spin on the ball, and more spin actually leads to more velocity, which we now know because of high-speed video. We can actually prove that this is true. And the other thing you can do is you can scuff the ball, and usually you get funny breaks on that. That's what Whitey Ford was accused of by Jim Bouton, and then about 10 years after the denials, he wrote his own book about how he did it, and that actually got the ball to sort of break. So those are 3 things you can do, and they're all kind of lumped together often. But in the 60s, there was a lot of call to legalize the spitball. This was supported by a lot of umpires. It was supported by the commissioner. It was supported by Joe Cronin, who was the president of the American League, but it was never supported by the National League. So they couldn't get the 2 leagues to agree. And back then, you had to have both leagues agree to change a rule of that magnitude. The DH was kind of the grand exception, where the National League sort of granted the American League the permission to do that. But there was a lot of talk about changing it. A lot of umpires wanted to get rid of it because it was so hard to enforce, and it just made their job a lot easier. They didn't have to worry about it. And I think there's always been this sort of sense within baseball that people are doing this stuff, and we certainly have quotes from managers that say, like, it's okay to use a little bit of spit, but I don't want to see the saliva like flinging off the ball. That's when it's going too far. Or, a little bit of scuff on the ball is one thing, but, some of the balls we got back, they were just way out of hand. But I think there's always been a sense that every team has a couple of these guys on their team, so nobody really wants to sort of drop the hammer unless somebody kind of gets caught. And I think so. To answer the question in the chat, which is why was Spider Tack eventually considered verboten? I think it really came down to efficacy. I don't think the players would have necessarily rejected this, because if you recall during this discussion, a lot of pitchers claimed they were doing it to protect the hitter, because if they had more control on the pitch, it would be less likely to hit the hitter. I don't know how true that is. That was their motivation, because it was also incredibly effective. But I think that the fact that it was so effective, I mean, and you may have heard batting averages are sinking every year, strikeouts are going up every year. I think that there is a lot of interest around baseball and making it easier to hit. And we have new rule changes coming next year, which essentially is trying to address that. If you are a student of baseball history, you know that that baseball has done this in the past when the hitting and pitching sort of gets out of whack a little bit. This has happened before, and currently it's gone too far in terms of the being too hard on the hitter, and I think that was basically what kind of happened. And then the other thing that happened, of course, is that there was a little bit of a scandal. I mean, there was a guy from the Angels who was actually one. Dan, you should probably tell this because you'll get this facts correct. But essentially, there was a guy with the Angels, a clubhouse guy that was found to be distributing all this stuff to all the pitchers.
Oh, that's right. I mean, and he named a bunch of them, and some denied it, and some just sort of didn't respond to the allegation. The only thing I would add to Mark, I mean, obviously covered it really well, is just going back to my comments on the sophistication of the kind of cheating. I think you have Spider Tack married with high-speed video and the Rapsodo and the Edutronic machines feels different than Whitey Ford putting something on the ball and firing it to Yogi and saying, "Hey, Yogi, what did that ball do? And do you think it was good?" I mean, I just think there's something. I mean, anyway, I think it feels different. And again, all the other Mark comments. I mean, clearly the efficacy of it and all the other stuff. But yeah, and again, people were getting actually named by clubhouse people who said that they thought that was part of their job, was to get these substances for the visiting pitchers. It was the visiting clubhouse person who was, getting stuff for the visiting pitchers.
So I don't know how, for those of you who followed this story sort of in real time, before the commissioner got involved, you may recall that it was Trevor Bauer who was the person who really came out against this stuff pretty early on, and to the point where he was also naming names. He named Cole, for one thing. He and Cole go way back in terms of not liking each other. They were teammates at UCLA. They didn't like each other then either. And he named Cole as a cheater, and he basically, Bauer was a incredibly bright student of how pitches worked, and he spent a lot of time at Driveline up in Seattle and learned how he could get all these things to happen. And he basically decided that, and he announced that anyone who throws the ball over this spin rate cannot do it without cheating. The human hand cannot throw a ball with this much spin. And then a lot of reporters would then immediately go, "You can figure this out. You can figure it out within seconds if you go to the right websites, exactly how much spin every single pitch has." And all of a sudden it was like, "Oh, look at Garrett Cole's spin rate. Look at Justin Verlander's spin rate." And Bauer even just to prove his point, he would go in and in a particular start, he would use this substance, get these ridiculous spin rates, and then come into the clubhouse afterwards and say, "See, I told you." So Bauer was part of this story and would have been a larger part in our book probably had he not sort of shown the world what other kind of problems he had. So we kind of didn't really make him a central part of the story, but yeah, it was kind of a big deal. This thing and of course the spin rates came down after the crackdown. The spin rates throughout the league went down, although they started to come up back up again this year, which leads a lot of people to believe that the substances are kind of back, but not in the places the umpires are checking. Any other questions?
I just have a brief comment. Mark, I wanted to thank you this morning for defending Ty Cobb on Twitter, because I know a lot of people think that he was a cheater and a bad guy, and because of that one book. But yeah, thank you for trying to correct the record about him. Much appreciated. And I talked to Cindy Cobb on Facebook, and I'm sure she appreciated it too. She's his daughter. So.
Okay, I'm going to break in here. We're just about done. We have a pretty much an hour-long window with SABR. I want to thank Mark, Dan. You guys were great, and I really appreciate it on behalf of Casey Stengel chapter. And everyone have a good night. God bless.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
I appreciate it. It's always good to talk baseball in the middle of the winter.
Exactly.
That it is.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.